The first snowflakes began to fall just before sundown, a soft, steady cascade that gradually blanketed the world around me in white. It was mid-December, the kind of deep winter that made everything seem silent, even the air. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, needing to get away from the chaos of everyday life. The cabin was remote, tucked away in the dense woods outside a small town in northern Minnesota. My friends had recommended it, saying it was the perfect getaway for solitude, with nothing but the howl of wolves and the occasional crack of a tree branch to break the silence. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The old wooden structure was just as I remembered from the photos. Sturdy, rustic, and oddly welcoming in its isolation. The cabin stood at the edge of a thick forest, with only a narrow trail leading up to it. No neighbors for miles.
No distractions.
The perfect place to clear my head. The snow had already accumulated by the time I unpacked, the weight of it causing the trees to creak under its load. I stepped out to get some firewood, and the air felt so cold it almost stung. It was the kind of cold that sank into your bones, making everything feel sharper, more alive. I spent the next hour chopping wood and preparing the fire, which was a welcome comfort against the encroaching chill. As I sat in front of the crackling flames, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't rushing, wasn't checking my phone, wasn't worrying about anything. But that peace didn't last long. Around midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The walls of the cabin groaned under the pressure of it, and the fire seemed to flicker with every gust. The snowstorm outside had grown heavier, and now the cabin felt even more isolated. The thought crossed my mind that I hadn't seen anyone for hours. Not even a vehicle had passed by on the road leading up to the cabin. It wasn't unusual, but something about it felt off. The silence was unnerving. I went to the window hoping to see something. A car, a light, anything. But the world outside was just a thick, swirling blur of snow. The storm had worsened rapidly, and the visibility was next to nothing. The thought of going out there, even to check for tracks, was unsettling. What if the storm was worse than I realized? What if I got lost? I tried to shake the feeling, retreating back to the warmth of the fire. I was about to close the curtains when I saw something in the distance, a figure moving slowly through the snow. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The figure wasn't far off, maybe 100 yards away. It was too far to make out any details, but there was no mistaking it. Person, a man, dressed in dark clothing, trudging through the deep snow at a deliberate pace. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the cold. What was he doing out there? Who was he? I watched for a few minutes, my heart starting to race. The figure stopped at the edge of the woods, standing motionless, just staring at the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I had to be careful. I didn't recognize him, and there wasn't supposed to be anyone else in this area. Not for miles. I grabbed my phone, but there was no service. Typical. Of course, there wouldn't be any service in the middle of nowhere. I glanced at the door, debating whether I should go outside and confront him. But that felt wrong. Something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I stood there in the dark, watching, waiting, hoping he would leave. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The storm outside howled louder, the wind rattling the windows. The man didn't move. His figure remained just barely visible, his outline framed by the white chaos of the snowstorm. Finally, I decided I couldn't just stand there any longer. I needed to do something. I grabbed my coat, threw it on, and stepped cautiously out into the cold. The wind cut through me like a knife, and I pulled my coat tighter around myself, squinting into the blizzard as I made my way toward the edge of the property. I didn't want to get too close to the man, but I needed to know what he was doing. When I reached the edge of the snowbank where the driveway met the woods, I stopped. My heart was hammering in my chest, the sound of it drowning out everything else. I stood there, staring out into the storm, waiting for the figure to move. But he didn't. I could barely make out the shape of him now, barely seeing anything but a vague silhouette. He was still standing in the same spot, facing the cabin. I took a few steps closer, feeling the tension in the air like a tangible force. The snow crunched under my boots, and I froze. The figure turned toward me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. His face was hidden by a hood, but I could see his eyes, bright, sharp, and unblinking. I stumbled back a step, my heart thundering in my chest. Why was he just standing there? What was he waiting for? Then, as quickly as he had turned, he vanished into the storm, his figure swallowed up by the white haze. I stood frozen for a moment, waiting to hear something, anything, to suggest he hadn't just disappeared into thin air. But there was nothing. I turned back to the cabin, my legs feeling like jelly as I made my way to the door. I locked it behind me, the sound of the bolt sliding into place somehow comforting. I stood in the entryway for a long time, my pulse still racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to shake off the feeling of unease, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right. The man outside, his strange stillness, his unblinking stare, it all felt wrong. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I spent the next few hours pacing the cabin, keeping an eye on the windows, the door, the woods outside. But as the night wore on, the snowstorm intensified, and I began to feel the exhaustion from the long drive. It had been a long, unsettling evening, but I forced myself to relax. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe I'd misinterpreted the whole situation. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my skin crawl. The thought of the man outside gnawed at me, refusing to let me rest. It wasn't until the next morning that I saw the footprints. They were fresh, too fresh to be from the storm. They led from the edge of the woods, where I'd seen the man standing, and came all the way up to the cabin. They stopped just short of the door. I froze when I saw them, my mind racing to make sense of it. How could the man have gotten so close without me noticing? And why didn't I hear anything? I didn't wait around to find out. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and headed straight for my car. The storm was still raging, but I didn't care. I had to leave. The drive back was tense, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. By the time I reached the nearest town, I felt a bit of relief. I stopped at the gas station to fill up, my breath still shallow, my heart still pounding in my chest. The attendant, a young man in his 20s, gave me a strange look as I paid, but I didn't care. I was just happy to be out of there. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder who that man was. Why had he been out there, in the middle of a snowstorm, staring at the cabin? What had he wanted? I would never know for sure, but one thing was clear. I was never going back to that cabin. The woods had a way of hiding things, secrets, stories, people. And sometimes it was better not to ask too many questions. The rain had started falling hard just as I entered the cabin. It wasn't supposed to be a long night. I was only here to check on a friend's place, get the fire started, make sure everything was in order before I headed back to town. But once the skies opened up, the darkness seemed to settle into the woods, and I knew things wouldn't go as planned. I'd always liked the woods. I grew up around them, spent weekends camping with my dad, but tonight felt different. The weight of the rain hitting the roof, the occasional crack of thunder shaking the walls, made the cabin seem small, almost suffocating. The fire crackled, the orange glow filling the room, but the storm outside drowned out every other sound. It was a sound that I couldn't ignore, loud, violent, like the world outside was in chaos. The storm didn't care about the little cabin. It just kept pouring. I wasn't alone in the cabin. My dog, Riley, had come along. I couldn't leave him behind. He wasn't just a dog, he was family. But even he seemed unsettled. His ears perked up every so often, and his eyes would dart toward the window, where the rain slapped the glass. He was a big dog, strong, loyal, but there was something about this storm that even he couldn't shake off. The night dragged on slowly. I'd been here for hours, and with no real distractions, I was left to my own thoughts. The storm wasn't letting up, the rain still coming down in sheets. The woods outside were lost in shadow, only the occasional flash of lightning giving any clue to what was out there. I tried to relax by the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get when you're scared of the dark, but a deep sense of something just beyond your reach, something wrong. I tried to ignore it, but every so often, Riley would growl low in his throat, his gaze fixed on the window. Then the knock came. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but no, it came again. A heavy, deliberate knock that rattled the door. My heart skipped. I rose to my feet, trying to shake the unease that had spread through me. Who would be out here in this weather? No one should be this far in the woods at night. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly walked toward the door. Riley, his tail tucked, stood by my side, his growl deepening. "Stay?" I whispered, as I opened the door a crack, the beam of light cutting through the night. There was nothing out there, just the rain, just the trees swaying in the wind. No one in sight. I stepped outside to look around, feeling foolish for even being on edge. The storm was thick, rain pouring, lightning flashing, thunder rumbling, but there was nothing but the noise of the storm. I closed the door behind me and turned the lock. Then it happened again. A knock. It was softer this time, almost tentative. But I knew. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to open that door. I stood still for a moment, listening to the rain batter the roof, the wind howling outside. And then, as I heard another knock, the door rattled on its hinges. It wasn't just any knock. It felt wrong, somehow. I didn't want to go to the door, but I had to know, had to see. I grabbed the flashlight again and turned the knob, pulling the door open. The wind hit me with a cold gust, and I felt the chill seep into my bones. But this time, I wasn't greeted by empty darkness. A man stood at the edge of the porch, tall, drenched, his clothes clinging to his frame. His face was shadowed, but I could make out the lines of his features, sharp, angular, but weathered. His eyes were dark, hollow, and staring straight at me. No words, no greeting, just silence between us, thick and heavy. I felt a surge of panic, but I didn't know what to do. The man didn't speak, didn't move. I couldn't see his hands, and the unease grew in my chest. I glanced down at Riley, whose growl was now a deep, constant rumble. "Can I help you?" I finally asked, my voice low, strained. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me with those dark eyes, his head slightly tilted as if studying me. The storm raged on around us, but in that moment, it felt like the world had gone still. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Should I call for help? What if he had some kind of weapon? What if he wasn't alone? Then, without a word, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. My pulse raced in my throat as I stood frozen, the wind howling around me. What the hell had just happened? I slammed the door shut, double-locked it, and backed away. Riley's growls didn't stop, though his eyes were fixed on the window. I grabbed the phone to call my friend, but there was no signal, just a silent, flashing no service. The storm continued, each strike of lightning brighter, the thunder louder, but the man never came back. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Riley and I stayed by the fire, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump, but nothing else happened. The morning came, gray and dreary. The rain had stopped, but the storm had left its mark. As I stepped outside to check the porch, my breath caught in my throat. The man's footprints were in the mud. Big, heavy prints, like he had stood there for a long time just watching. And at the base of the steps, something was lying in the dirt. It was a small, crumpled note. I unfolded it, my hands trembling as I read the single line written in messy scrawl. Asterisk, next time. It won't be just me. Asterisk, I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed Riley, packed up, and left. The road out of the woods felt longer than it ever had before. The world felt too big and I felt small. But the thing that stayed with me, that lingered in my thoughts, was the man's eyes. How they had stared at me, cold, unblinking. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was out there, and it wasn't finished with me. I never went back to that cabin again. I was never the type to be scared of the woods. I grew up hunting, fishing, and spending days deep in the backcountry without a second thought. The solitude never bothered me. If anything, I preferred it. Some people get nervous when they're miles away from the nearest person. I found comfort in it. Out there, the world was simple. No traffic, no noise, just the steady rhythm of the forest. It was early November when I planned the trip. A solo hunting trip to an old cabin in the mountains, a place my father had used when he was young. He had always spoken of it fondly. A sturdy little thing, built back in the 50s, tucked away in a valley where the deer moved through like clockwork. It wasn't fancy, but it kept the wind off, and that's all that mattered. The hike in wasn't too bad, about 6 miles from where I parked the truck. The first few miles were easy enough, following a dirt logging road, but the last 2 were rough, dense timber, fallen trees, and steep terrain. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the ridgeline, washing everything in a deep orange glow. The place was just like my dad had described, weathered but solid. A single-room cabin with a small wood stove, a cot, and an old wooden table with 2 chairs. The door had a simple latch, nothing fancy, and there was a stack of firewood piled up against the side. No electricity, no running water, just the essentials. I set my gear down, took a long drink from my canteen, and got to work setting up for the night. The first order of business was starting a fire. The temperature had dropped fast, and I could already see my breath in the fading light. The stove took a little coaxing, but soon enough, the cabin was filled with the smell of burning wood and that dry heat you only get from a real fire. After eating a quick meal, I set out my sleeping bag on the cot, checked my rifle, and made sure everything was in order for the morning hunt. I planned to wake up before dawn, hike up to a ridgeline about a mile out, and set up before first light. The place was supposed to be prime for deer this time of year. That first night, I slept well. The wind howled outside, rattling the trees, but inside, the cabin was warm. It was the kind of deep sleep that only comes after a long day of hiking. When I woke, it was still dark. I dressed quickly, threw on my pack, and stepped out into the cold. The air was crisp, the kind that bites at your face and stings your lungs. I set off toward the ridge, moving slow, careful with each step. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. As I climbed, the first light started creeping over the horizon, turning the sky from black to a dull gray. I found a good spot near some rocks, settled in, and waited. Hours passed. I saw movement a few times, a flash of antlers, the flick of a tail, but nothing presented a clear shot. That was fine. I had time. By midday, the wind had picked up, pushing through the trees with a low moan. I decided to head back to the cabin for lunch and wait out the worst of it. The hike back was uneventful, but as I approached the cabin, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first. Just a feeling like something was out of place. Then I saw it. The door was open. Not just open, wide open, like someone had thrown it that way. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. I knew I had shut that door. The latch wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the wind from blowing it open. My first thought was a bear. Maybe it had smelled my food and pushed its way in. But as I stepped closer, I saw no signs of an animal. No claw marks, no tracks in the dirt outside. I gripped my rifle a little tighter and stepped inside. Everything was the same. The sleeping bag was still on the cot. My gear was where I had left it. The firewood was stacked neatly in the corner. The only thing that was different was the door. I stood there for a long time listening. Nothing, just the wind outside, rattling the trees. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been the wind. Maybe I hadn't latched the door as well as I thought. I shut it again, secured it as best I could, and tried to shake the feeling creeping up my spine. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I went back out for the evening hunt but didn't see much. When I returned, the cabin was as I had left it. That night, though, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was dark. The wind had died down outside. Then I heard it. A sound. A soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Not heavy, not crashing through the brush like an animal. These were careful, slow, right outside the cabin. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Silence. For a long time, I didn't move. Then, just as I started to convince myself I had imagined it, the door creaked. Not much, just a little, just enough. I reached for my rifle, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Minutes passed. The door never opened. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, moving away this time, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night. At first light, I stepped outside, rifle at the ready. There were footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping just outside the door. I followed them for a while, but they led off into the woods and eventually disappeared. I packed my things, doused the fire, and left that place behind. I never went back. I was 26 when I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains. It was a late September evening when I arrived at the cabin, deep in the woods, far away from any town. The air smelled thick with pine and the earthy scent of damp soil. My phone had no signal, and the GPS didn't work once I hit the dirt roads that led to the cabin. It was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, quiet, and a chance to escape everything. I'd rented the cabin online through a small local agency. It was a simple wooden structure with a small front porch and a woodpile stacked beside it. I wasn't sure what drew me to it. Maybe it was the pictures of the fire in the hearth or the rustic charm of it all. It was the perfect place to spend a few days away from work and people. As soon as I parked my car and stepped out, the air felt different. Cold, but not in a way that was uncomfortable. It was just enough to make you feel alive. I took a deep breath and made my way inside the cabin, opening the creaky door to reveal a single room with a stone fireplace, a worn-out leather couch, and a kitchen nook. It was cozy, if not a bit dated, with wood beams overhead and dark floors. I unpacked my bag and made myself at home, lighting the fire in the hearth and setting my things down on the kitchen counter. The silence of the cabin was comforting, and for a moment, I let myself relax, enjoying the stillness of the world outside. The woods were thick and dense, nothing but trees and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. It was around 8 p.m. when I decided to take a walk. I put on my jacket and stepped out the front door, shutting it quietly behind me. The sky was overcast, a few dark clouds hanging low, but there was no sign of rain. The air smelled fresh, like wet earth and pine, and I felt completely alone, in the best way possible. I walked for what felt like hours, only the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots for company. The further I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees were tall and thick, their branches intertwining like fingers reaching up into the sky. It was beautiful, but there was an odd feeling in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the quiet, or the fact that I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I turned back toward the cabin when the sky darkened and the temperature dropped. The walk back was shorter, but by the time I reached the cabin again, it felt as though the woods had become quieter. Too quiet. The usual sounds of birds or animals seemed to have vanished. I shook the feeling off, telling myself it was nothing. After all, I was alone in the woods, and it was probably just my mind playing tricks. I locked the door behind me and settled in front of the fire with a cup of tea, watching the flames crackle and pop. Outside, the wind had picked up, but I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until the sound of something scratching against the cabin's walls that I first felt uneasy. At first, it was subtle, just a faint scraping noise that could have easily been the wind or a branch. But then it happened again, louder this time, and it sounded like it was coming from the back of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, setting my tea aside, and walked toward the window, peering out into the dark. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no sign of anything near the cabin. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the area around me. The silence that followed was thick, pressing in on me. Felt wrong. The woods, which had been peaceful when I arrived, now seemed ominous. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but my feet felt frozen to the floor. Then I heard it again. This time it was louder, almost like claws scraping against wood. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal, raccoons, or some kind of small creature, maybe even a bear. But as I slowly moved toward the back door, I realized I hadn't seen any wildlife since I arrived. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and opened the door, stepping out cautiously. The night was cold, and the wind picked up as I walked toward the back of the cabin. I shone the beam of the flashlight against the walls, but there was nothing. No sign of an animal, no marks on the wood. I turned slowly, scanning the trees beyond, but the darkness beyond the cabin was impenetrable. I stood there for a while, my breath coming out in misty clouds, trying to shake the unease that was crawling up my spine. The wind howled through the trees, but it didn't help to calm me. I turned back and locked the door, then sat back down in front of the fire, my mind racing. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. But as the night wore on, the strange noises continued. They came and went, sometimes light, sometimes loud, always from different parts of the cabin. Scratching, scraping, thumping, and the occasional creak, like something was moving just outside the walls. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. I kept the fire burning, hoping it would bring some comfort, but the cabin felt colder than it should have. I couldn't explain why, but every minute felt stretched, drawn out. As I sat there, the scraping noises started again. This time it was louder, closer, almost as if something was trying to get in. I stood up, my body tense, my mind racing. There was no way an animal could be making that much noise, no way it could sound so deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside again, my feet crunching on the gravel as I moved around the cabin. The wind was picking up, making it hard to hear anything clearly, but I couldn't ignore the sensation that something was watching me from the trees. I checked the windows, the walls, everything. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches, no damage. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. The air was thick with tension. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, and my skin prickled with fear. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing, but the sound of scratching grew louder again, this time from the front door. I stood up, flashlight shaking in my hand. I reached for the door handle, but before I could even touch it, the sound stopped. Everything was silent. Then, a sound from behind me, a creak, like someone had stepped on the floorboards. I spun around, but the room was empty. I grabbed my bag, my phone, anything I could get my hands on, and ran outside. The wind had died down, but the woods were still silent, too silent. I ran through the trees, my heart pounding, the flashlight beam dancing wildly in front of me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out of there. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, my legs aching, my breath ragged. The cabin was a distant silhouette in the woods, but I could still feel it. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I didn't return to that cabin. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't want to. All I know is that when I finally got to the nearest town, I heard rumors about the place. How people who stayed there would sometimes disappear or leave without a word, saying they never wanted to talk about it. I'm not going back. Whatever was out there, whatever made those noises, it was something I should have never come face to face with. I can't explain it, and I don't want to. The only thing I know is that when I left, I didn't just leave the cabin. I left something else behind in those woods. And whatever it was, I hope it stays there. It was the kind of weekend I had been looking forward to for months. My cousin Mark had invited me and my wife, Rachel, to spend a few days in the woods at his cabin. He and his wife, Sarah, had recently moved to a rural area not far from the outskirts of a small town in upstate New York. They had found a place deep in the woods, tucked away where the only sounds you could hear were birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. No neighbors for miles, just peace, silence, and nature. I wasn't sure about staying in a cabin that isolated, especially with winter creeping in, but the promise of a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city was too appealing. I wasn't much of an outdoorsy type, but Mark and Sarah seemed excited to host, and Rachel was eager for the break. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. The road became narrow as we got closer, barely wide enough for our car to fit. Trees stood tall on either side, their branches bare after the first heavy frost of the season. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows over the road, and I felt a strange unease creeping in. I didn't let it bother me too much, though. It was just the isolation that felt unnerving. Mark greeted us with a wide smile when we arrived. He was a tall guy, broad-shouldered, with a gruff voice and a laugh that seemed to fill the room. His wife, Sarah, was quieter, more reserved but friendly in her own way. She had a calm presence, which helped to ease my nerves as we unpacked our bags and settled into the small, rustic cabin. Inside, the place was cozy. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner of the living room, crackling as it threw off a comforting heat. The floors were creaky, the kind of old wood that groaned underfoot, and the walls were lined with simple furniture. A large bookshelf filled one corner, and the kitchen was small but functional, with wooden counters and a vintage stove that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. That first night, we settled in quickly. Mark had stocked up on food, and we all sat around the dining table, drinking beer and talking. Sarah had made a hearty stew, and it filled the air with the kind of warmth that made you feel safe. But as the evening wore on, the wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees with a force that rattled the windows. "Sounds like a storm's coming," Mark said, glancing out the window. "There's a weather front moving in." We all nodded. I didn't think much of it. The storm was expected, and the cabin felt like a fortress against the weather outside. I could hear the wind howling, but inside, the fire crackled warmly, and we continued with our night. It wasn't until later that the unease I felt started to grow. After dinner, Sarah and Rachel went to bed early. Mark and I stayed up, talking about old times and drinking another beer or two. It was then that I started to notice something odd. There was a strange noise outside. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping sound against the cabin walls. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Mark looked up, his brow furrowed. "Probably just the wind. Old place like this. The trees rub against the walls." I tried to brush it off, but the sound kept coming. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was something more deliberate, something that didn't feel natural. A soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone was trying to get our attention. I stood up, looking out the small window next to the door, but there was nothing but darkness and trees. "All right, I'm gonna check it out," Mark said, standing up with a grunt. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice betraying my unease. He waved me off. "It's nothing. I'll be back in a minute." Mark stepped outside into the cold night air, and I stood by the door, waiting. I felt like I should go with him, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. A minute passed, then another. I felt my stomach tighten. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the wind or the trees. I don't know why, but a deep sense of dread settled over me. I moved toward the door, slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I cracked it open just enough to stick my head out, but Mark wasn't in sight. "Mark," I called, my voice carrying out into the dark. No answer, only the howling wind. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face. The night was almost completely dark now, save for the faint glow of the cabin's light spilling out onto the porch. The trees loomed over me, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I strained my ears, but there was no sound, no Mark, no tapping, nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a figure standing still at the edge of the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. It was just a silhouette, barely visible against the backdrop of the forest. I squinted, trying to make it out. Whoever or whatever it was stood perfectly still, as if watching me. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Mark," I called again, louder this time. Still no response. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I spun around in shock, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. It was Mark. He was back, breathing hard, his eyes wide with something I couldn't place. "We need to go inside," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." I didn't ask why. I didn't care. I just followed him back into the cabin, and as we slammed the door shut behind us, the tapping sound returned. It was louder now, closer, and I knew something was wrong. Something wasn't right about the way Mark looked. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark ran a hand through his hair, clearly shaken. I don't know. I went out there to check, and there was nothing. But then I heard something moving. Something heavy. It was right behind me. A shiver ran down my spine. "What do you mean, something heavy?" "I don't know," Mark muttered. It was like footsteps, but not human. Too heavy, too slow. And then I saw someone, person, standing in the shadows. I couldn't see their face. They just stood there and watched me. Didn't move. I felt a cold wave wash over me. It was like the whole cabin had gotten colder, like the walls were closing in. I glanced out the window again. There was still nothing out there, but the unease gnawed at me. Rachel and Sarah woke up shortly after, and Mark told them what had happened. Sarah was concerned, but Rachel was more annoyed than anything. "You guys are letting your imaginations get the best of you," she said, rubbing her eyes. But that didn't change the fact that something was out there, something that wasn't human. The tapping continued throughout the night, sporadic but unrelenting. Each time it stopped, I felt a brief sense of relief, only to have it start up again a few minutes later. Eventually, the storm hit, and the wind roared louder than before. The trees seemed to bend under its force, and I half expected the roof to be torn off the cabin. The tapping grew more frantic, now almost like knocking, as if someone was trying to get inside. We didn't sleep that night. None of us. We sat in the living room, huddled together, waiting for the storm to pass. Every few minutes, Mark would peer through the window, checking the tree line. Nothing ever moved. By morning, the storm had passed, but the tension was still thick in the air. Mark suggested we pack up and head into town for the day, just to get a break from the cabin. No one argued. We gathered our things quickly, anxious to leave the cabin behind, even if just for a few hours. As we drove out of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. The forest, dark and silent now in the daylight, seemed to be holding its breath. I never figured out what that tapping was or who or what was standing out in the woods. We never spoke of it again after that trip. But I never went back to that cabin. Mark and Sarah did. They stayed there despite everything. They said it was just a fluke, that maybe it was animals or something. But every time I think of that night, I can still hear the tapping. And I know whatever was out there wasn't human. It was one of those rare weekends when we managed to escape the city and find a little peace in the woods. My husband, Daniel, and I had been looking forward to it for months. A cozy weekend in a secluded cabin by a lake. It was the kind of place you'd drive past on your way to somewhere else, the kind of place people usually associate with relaxation and nature. It seemed like the perfect getaway. We had rented the cabin from a family that owned a small bed and breakfast business upstate. The road leading to the cabin was barely paved, and by the time we arrived, the sun had just begun to dip beneath the treeline, casting everything in soft golden light. It felt like the world had slowed down for us. The cabin was small but charming, made from rough-hewn wood, and it had that familiar smell of pine and earth that always seemed to make everything feel grounded. The front porch had a pair of old rocking chairs that creaked softly as the evening breeze passed through, and there was a fire pit out back. Perfect spot to unwind after the drive. Daniel and I unpacked the car, carrying in our bags, cooler, and some firewood. We were both tired, but it was the kind of tired that felt good. The kind that made you want to sit back, relax, and forget about everything else for a while. We had a quick dinner, sandwiches and fruit, and spent the next hour enjoying the stillness of the evening. By the time the stars started appearing in the clear sky, the only sound around us was the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant croak of frogs. There was something incredibly peaceful about it, like the world was holding its breath. Daniel started a fire in the pit, and we settled in the chairs with our feet up, letting the warmth of the flames wash over us. We didn't speak much. It wasn't necessary. We both enjoyed the quiet, but as the night stretched on, I started to notice how dark it had gotten. I hadn't realized just how isolated the cabin was. The nearest neighbor, the family who owned the place, was miles away. It was getting colder, and I could feel the temperature dropping rapidly. Daniel suggested we go inside, but I wasn't quite ready to leave the fire. I liked the way the shadows danced around us and how the fire crackled in the silence. The evening passed without incident, but something began to gnaw at me. A subtle feeling of unease, the kind that creeps up when you're alone in the woods at night. At first, I shrugged it off as just the natural tension of being out in the wilderness. but there was a shift in the air. The trees around us seemed to close in, their silhouettes more threatening than comforting. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. I glanced around, half expecting to see eyes in the dark, but there was nothing, only the shadows stretching long and deep around the cabin. Finally, Daniel stood up and stretched. "Let's call it a night." We headed inside, the warmth of the cabin a welcome relief from the chill outside. I locked the door behind us, but something about the darkness outside, the absence of light from the fire, still unsettled me. I brushed it off, though, telling myself it was just my imagination. Daniel was already getting ready for bed, his back to me as he removed his jacket and shoes. I climbed into bed beside him, but sleep wasn't coming easy. I kept hearing small noises outside, things that didn't seem to make sense. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as the hours passed, the sounds grew more distinct. A soft scraping sound against the wood, the unmistakable crunch of leaves beneath heavy footsteps. And then, just as I thought I was imagining things, there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first, like a tap, but it repeated a second time, harder. I froze. Daniel didn't seem to hear it, or if he did, he ignored it, already snoring lightly beside me. My heart began to race. Who could be knocking at our door in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I slid out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Daniel. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly crept to the window and peered out. The darkness was thick, impenetrable. Couldn't see a thing, but I could still hear the crunch of footsteps, distant now but unmistakable. A strange chill ran down my spine, and I backed away from the window. I knew it was crazy, but I couldn't help the creeping suspicion that we weren't alone out here. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. The wind howled outside, making the trees creak and groan like they were trying to warn me. I kept my gaze fixed on the door, as if waiting for another knock, but it never came. Instead, I heard something else, rustling in the woods closer this time. Then there was a soft scraping against the window, followed by a low, almost imperceptible sound. A breath, maybe, or a whisper. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know if I should wake Daniel or try to deal with whatever it was myself. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger. Whatever was out there was no longer just passing by. It was circling, waiting, and I was certain it knew we were inside. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but no more sounds came. Everything was still, too still. I slowly turned to look at Daniel, who was still sound asleep. The tension in my body was unbearable. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to wait a little longer, hoping whatever it was would leave. But then I heard it again. A knock, louder this time, more deliberate. I jumped back, my pulse racing. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer beside the bed and turned it on, pointing it at the door. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the old wooden walls of the cabin. I stepped cautiously toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The moment my fingers brushed it, the knocking started again, this time accompanied by a soft scrape against the wood. It was almost like something was testing the door, as if it knew I was right on the other side. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, but I was no longer sure if it was fear or something else that had taken over. My mind raced through the possibilities. An animal, a prank, maybe even a neighbor who'd come to check on us. But none of those explanations seemed to fit. Whatever was out there was too quiet, too deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scraping sound continued, followed by a low rustling, as if something was moving just outside, something trying to stay hidden. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The air grew still, and I waited, wondering if my mind had played tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. I could still feel it, the presence, the unmistakable sensation that we weren't alone. I moved back to the window and peered out once more, my heart pounding in my chest. This time I saw something, a figure, barely visible, standing near the edge of the trees. Tall, thin, and completely still. It was watching us. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't even move. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table and dialed the number for the family who owned the cabin. But when the line picked up, there was no answer. Suddenly, I heard a voice, low and unintelligible, coming from the other side of the window. My mind raced. I needed to wake Daniel, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was still there, standing motionless in the dark. I whispered his name, Daniel. He stirred, but it took a moment before he fully woke up. What's wrong? There's someone outside. I think we're being watched. His eyes shifted from sleepy confusion to alertness. He grabbed the flashlight and began moving toward the door, but I grabbed his arm.
No.
We shouldn't open the door, I said, my voice trembling. He paused, looking at me, and then at the window where I pointed toward the dark shape standing outside. It hadn't moved, but I could still feel its presence, like it was waiting for something. We both stayed silent, listening. The only sound was the wind howling in the trees. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It stepped back into the darkness, disappearing between the trees. I looked at Daniel, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. We decided then, without saying a word, that we were leaving. We packed up our things as quickly as we could, hardly even checking to make sure we had everything. I locked the door behind us, and we hurried to the car. The drive back down the winding road felt endless. It wasn't until we were miles away that the unease finally began to fade. But we both knew that whatever we had felt out there, it wasn't over. It hadn't just been a strange night in the woods. Something or someone had been waiting for us, and whatever it was still out there. It was the middle of November, the air cold but not yet brutal, the trees bare but still clinging to a few stubborn brown leaves. I had planned this hunting trip for weeks. It was something I did every year, a solo retreat into the wilderness for a few days. Just me, my rifle, and the quiet stillness of nature. I had been hunting since I was a kid. My dad had taught me how to track deer, how to move through the woods without making a sound, and most importantly, how to respect the land. I wasn't out here just to kill something. I was out here because it felt like the only place where I could breathe. The only place where the world didn't feel like it was closing in on me. I drove my truck down the long dirt road that led into the woods. The hunting cabin wasn't mine, not really. It had been in the family for years, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and now I was the only one who still used it. The place was old, built back in the 50s, a simple wooden structure with a tin roof and a stone fireplace. There was no electricity, no running water, just a few old pieces of furniture and a wood stove to keep warm. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was overcast, the sun barely visible behind a thick layer of gray clouds. The drive had been long, nearly 6 hours, and I was exhausted. I parked my truck beside the cabin, grabbed my gear, and made my way inside. The door was stiff, the wood swollen from the damp air, but I forced it open with a hard shove. Inside, everything was just as I had left it last year. The old wooden table in the center of the room, the rusted lantern on the shelf, the stack of firewood by the stove. The air was stale, smelling of dust and aged wood. I set my rifle down on the table and took a deep breath. The first thing I did was get a fire going. The cold had already seeped into my bones, and I knew it would only get worse once the sun went down. I stacked a few logs in the stove, lit a match, and within minutes, the flames crackled to life, filling the cabin with a dim, flickering light. I spent the next hour unpacking my gear, checking my rifle and making sure everything was in order. Then, just as the last traces of daylight began to fade, I heard something outside. It was a soft sound, barely noticeable over the wind, but enough to make me stop what I was doing. A rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, listening. The woods were full of sounds. Branches creaking, leaves shifting, animals moving through the trees. But this was different. It was slow, deliberate. I stepped to the window and peered outside. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the darkness creeping in between them like ink spreading through water. I scanned the treeline but saw nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a deer. Nothing to worry about, but still I felt uneasy. I turned away from the window and sat down at the table. I pulled out a can of soup from my bag, heated it over the stove, and forced myself to eat. The unease in my stomach didn't go away. As the night deepened, the wind picked up. The trees groaned, their skeletal branches scraping against each other like brittle bones. The cabin creaked, settling into itself with old, tired noises. And then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. This time it was closer, a soft crunch of footsteps on frozen leaves. My blood ran cold. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping tightly around the stock. My heart pounded in my chest. I moved silently to the window, keeping low, careful not to cast a shadow against the glass. Outside, the trees stood motionless. The wind had died down, leaving the woods eerily silent. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I was tired. Maybe I hadn't slept enough the night before. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and lay down on the old cot in the corner of the room. My rifle rested beside me, within arm's reach. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound made my body tense. Every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin. My mind kept replaying the noise over and over, trying to make sense of it. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A single, sharp knock on the cabin door. I stopped breathing. My eyes snapped open, my fingers tightening around my rifle. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. For what felt like an eternity, I just lay there, heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was outside would hear it. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the knocking stopped. I waited. The silence stretched on. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and at some point, I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, the fire had gone out, and the inside of the cabin was ice cold. The morning light filtered weakly through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. I sat up, my body stiff and sore. For a moment, I thought maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I had imagined the knocking. Then I saw the footprints. They started at the edge of the trees, leading up to the cabin door. And then, just a few feet away, they stopped. No return tracks, no sign of anything moving away. Whoever or whatever had been outside my cabin that night was still out there, somewhere, watching. I packed my things as fast as I could, grabbed my rifle, and didn't look back. I didn't go hunting that year, and I haven't been back to that cabin since. It was late October when I took the job. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones had already settled in, and the days were short. The job was simple, at least that's what I thought. A friend of mine, Dan, had hooked me up with it. He worked for a property management company, and they needed someone to keep an eye on an old cabin near a graveyard for a few weeks. The cabin belonged to a family that had long since moved away, and they wanted it looked after before they decided what to do with it. There had been issues with trespassers. People were breaking in, vandalizing, leaving trash behind. The company didn't want to pay for an expensive security system, so they figured a live-in caretaker was the next best thing. I didn't mind. I needed the money, and I wasn't the type to get scared easily. The idea of spending a few weeks in a quiet place away from the city actually sounded appealing. I wasn't superstitious, and I didn't believe in ghost stories. The graveyard didn't bother me. It was just a patch of land with some old headstones, forgotten by time. The drive out there was uneventful. The cabin was deep in the woods, off a barely maintained dirt road. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The place was exactly what I expected. A small, worn-down cabin, nothing fancy. It had a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with an old fireplace. No electricity, no running water. Just a wood stove and a lantern. I dropped my bag on the floor and took a look around. The cabin smelled like damp wood and dust, but otherwise it seemed fine. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they locked properly. If anyone had been squatting here, they hadn't left any signs. The graveyard was only about 50 yards from the cabin, just past a few dead trees. I could see the tops of the old headstones through the thinning leaves. It wasn't a big cemetery, probably only a few dozen graves, most of them from the 1800s. Some were so worn down that the names were barely legible. That first night was uneventful. I sat in the chair by the wood stove, reading a book by lantern light. The wind howled outside, rattling the trees. It was colder than I expected. I could hear the occasional rustling in the woods, probably deer or raccoons. The isolation didn't bother me. I had spent enough time camping alone to be used to nights like this. The next few days passed in a slow, repetitive cycle. Wake up, check the perimeter, make sure no one had been poking around, chop some wood, eat, sleep. The nights were the hardest, not because I was scared, but because there was nothing to do. The silence became almost oppressive. I started noticing little things after the first few days. The front door was slightly ajar one morning, even though I was sure I had locked it. The next night, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. I went out with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything. A few nights later, I woke up to a noise. Not the usual sounds of the woods, this was different. A slow, deliberate sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I sat up in bed, listening. The wind had died down, and the forest was unnervingly silent. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was bitterly cold, my breath coming out in clouds. I shined the light around the clearing, but everything looked normal. I turned toward the graveyard. That's when I saw it. One of the headstones had been moved. Not just knocked over, moved, dragged several feet from its original spot. My stomach clenched. It wasn't possible. Headstones didn't just move on their own. Someone had to have done this. But why? I walked over, shining my light across the names. The stone was old, weathered. I didn't recognize the name, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had been here, messing with the graves. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods. The trees loomed in the darkness, silent and unmoving. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat awake for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked again. The headstone was still out of place. No new footprints, no signs of anyone being there. I told myself it must have been animals, maybe the ground shifting. But I didn't believe it. The following night, I woke up to a new sound. A slow, deliberate tapping. It was coming from the window. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest. The tapping came again. I forced myself to sit up. The lantern's glow barely reached the window. I could only see the reflection of the room. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. There was nothing outside, but the graveyard looked different. I walked to the door, my hands shaking. The night air was sharp, cutting through my clothes. I turned toward the graveyard. Several headstones had been moved, not knocked over, moved. Some were upright, just not in their original spots. Others were tilted at odd angles, half sunk into the ground as if they had been partially buried and dug up again. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. I stayed inside for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things. The job wasn't worth it. I called Dan, told him I was leaving. He was annoyed but didn't argue. I didn't tell him the details. I just said I wasn't comfortable staying out there. Before I left, I took one last look at the graveyard. The headstones were back in place, exactly where they had been when I first arrived. I drove away without looking back. I never took another job like that again. Whatever had been out there, moving those stones, I didn't want to know. And I never went back. The rain had been falling in a steady rhythm since the sun set, tapping against the roof of the small ranger's cabin. It was the kind of rain that soaked into everything, making the night feel colder, heavier. I'd been working the night shift for nearly 2 years now, patrolling the thick forests that stretched across the hills outside of town. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was quiet, peaceful for the most part. The cabin sat about 12 miles from the nearest road, deep in the woods where only service trucks and ATVs could reach. It was one of the old ranger outposts, built sometime in the 70s, its wooden frame creaking in the wind. There was a small radio inside, a couple of bunk beds, a desk, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. That was it. No TV, no internet, just the sound of the rain and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. I'd started my shift at 7, making my usual rounds in the truck before settling in at the cabin to wait out the storm. The job was mostly uneventful, making sure hikers weren't getting lost, checking in on hunters, keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't explain it, just an itch at the back of my mind, like I was forgetting something important. The radio crackled. It had been silent for the past few hours, just occasional bursts of static. Then a voice cut through, low and distorted by the storm. "Got a call? Checking in." I sat up, grabbing the radio from the table. It was Parker, one of the senior rangers. He worked the station in town, covering the late shifts when I was out here alone. "What's going on?" I asked, adjusting the volume. Local called in something strange. Said they saw headlights near the old fire road about 2 miles from your position. "Might be nothing, but you should check it out." I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. The fire road had been abandoned for years, closed off after a mudslide wiped out most of the trail. No one had any business being out there, especially in this weather. "I'll head out," I said, grabbing my rain jacket from the chair. The wind howled as I stepped outside, the cold rain hitting my face like tiny needles. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as I drove down the narrow dirt road, the tires slipping in the thick mud. The forest felt different at night, less like trees and more like walls closing in, the branches moving in the wind like reaching hands. After about 15 minutes, I reached the fire road. It was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and brush, the path leading into the darkness like an open mouth. I turned off the engine and stepped out, my boots sinking into the mud. The rain was heavier here, making it hard to see past the trees. I pulled out my flashlight and started walking, my breath coming out in small white clouds. And then I saw them, tire tracks, fresh ones. They led off the main road and deeper into the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. I followed them, moving carefully, the mud making each step feel unsteady. The air smelled damp and earthy, mixed with something else, something metallic. Took me a moment to realize what I was smelling. Blood. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The tracks led to a small clearing where an old hunting cabin sat tucked between the trees. It was one of the many abandoned structures left behind over the years, forgotten and rotting under the weight of time. The door was slightly open, moving with the wind, a faint yellow light spilling from inside. I stepped forward, my boots squelching in the mud, and that's when I saw it. The body, a man lying face down in the doorway. His clothes were soaked, his skin pale, almost blue. The rain had washed away most of the blood, but I could still see where it had pooled beneath him, dark and thick. My stomach twisted, my mind racing through the possibilities. An accident? A hunter caught in the storm? But then I saw the wound on his back. A deep, jagged cut running from his shoulder to his hip, too clean to be from an animal. Someone had done this. I stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything. The man's face was turned to the side, his eyes open, his expression frozen in something between shock and fear. I didn't recognize him, but he looked local. Someone from town, maybe. I reached for my radio with a shaking hand. "Parker," I said, my voice barely steady. "I've got a body. Hunting cabin off the fire road." Static. Then, "Say again." "Dead body. Male. Looks recent." Pause. Then, "Stay put. I'm calling it in." I lowered the radio, my fingers cold and stiff. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin groan. I didn't want to go inside, but something told me I had to. I stepped over the body, pushing the door open wider. The cabin smelled of damp wood and something else, something rotten. There was an old table in the center, a few empty bottles scattered across it. A chair lay on its side, broken. In the corner, a second cot was pushed against the wall, its blankets disturbed like someone had been sleeping there recently. And then I saw the second body. This one was inside, slumped against the wall. A younger man, maybe mid-20s. His shirt was soaked in blood, a deep wound in his stomach. His hands were clenched into fists, his nails dug into his palms. A struggle. I swallowed hard, backing away. Two dead men, both attacked with a blade. No sign of who did it, no sign of why. The radio crackled. "Parker, I've got units on the way. Stay where you are." I didn't respond. My eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, where something glinted in the dim light. A knife, its blade smeared with blood, lying just beneath the cot. My stomach dropped. Whoever did this had left in a hurry, or they were still nearby. I turned toward the door, stepping over the body again. The rain had washed away most of the footprints, but I could still see faint impressions leading into the woods. The wind howled, the trees moved, and then I saw it just beyond the tree line. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching me, my breath caught in my throat. Then, slowly, they turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't follow, couldn't. The sirens came 10 minutes later, red and blue lights flashing through the trees. Parker was the first one out of the truck, his face grim as he took in the scene. The investigation lasted weeks. The two men had been local drifters, squatting in the cabin. No one knew why they were killed or who had done it. The blood on the knife didn't match any records. No one ever found the figure I saw that night. And the worst part? A third set of footprints had been found in the mud, leading away from the cabin, leading toward my truck. I never worked the night shift again. It was late October when I took the job. I was between things, just looking for a quiet place to clear my head. A man I met through a mutual friend had a cabin in the forests near the French border, and he needed someone to watch over it for a few weeks while he took care of family business in the city. It was an old, simple place, just a wooden structure with a stone chimney, a small bedroom, and a living space with a stove. No electricity, just gas lamps and a woodpile out back. He told me the place was isolated, but that was fine by me. I'd spent most of my life in cities, and the thought of being somewhere so quiet sounded like exactly what I needed.
No noise.
No people, just trees, air, and time to think. The first few days were uneventful. I gathered firewood, kept the place tidy, and cooked simple meals over the stove. The only sounds at night were the wind through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I'd brought a few books, but mostly I just sat by the fire, letting my mind settle into the quiet. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. Then, a few nights in, I saw her. It had been raining off and on all day, and the air outside was thick with mist. I was sitting by the window, staring out at the tree line, when something caught my eye, a figure barely visible through the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, shadows shifting between the trees. But as I watched, the figure became clearer. A woman, standing just at the edge of the clearing, where the trees met the open ground around the cabin. She didn't move. I sat there for what felt like forever, staring at her. She was too far away for me to make out her face, but something about the way she stood, so still, so quiet, sent a cold feeling through me. She wasn't dressed for the weather. Her clothes were thin, and she didn't seem to have a jacket or any kind of bag. I don't know how long I sat there watching her, but eventually, the mist thickened again, and she faded from view. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a lost hiker, someone who had wandered too far from a trail. But the feeling stuck with me long after she was gone. The next morning, I walked out to where I had seen her, but there were no tracks in the wet grass. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. I told myself I had imagined it, that maybe the isolation was getting to me, making me see things. But that night, she came back. This time, she was closer. I had just stoked the fire when I glanced out the window and saw her again, standing halfway between the tree line and the cabin. The mist wasn't as thick that night, and I could see her more clearly. She was tall, with long, dark hair that hung limply down her back. Her clothes were odd, outdated, like something from another time. She was staring at the cabin. At me. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. Even though I couldn't see her face clearly, I knew she was watching me. I didn't move. I don't know how long I sat there, barely breathing, watching her. But eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, took a deep breath, and pointed it out the window. She was gone. No movement, no sound, just the empty clearing. I barely slept that night. The next day, I forced myself to go outside to check the area again. I walked the entire clearing, scanning the ground, looking for footprints, for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. I told myself again that I was imagining things, that maybe the fog, the darkness, and my own nerves were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The following night, I kept the lamps burning as long as I could. I sat by the fire, forcing myself not to look out the window. If she was there, I didn't want to know. But just before midnight, I heard something, a sound outside, near the front of the cabin. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling, like someone shifting their weight on the damp ground. Then slowly it grew louder. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving closer. I held my breath, gripping the arms of my chair, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped just outside the door. Silence. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away, fading into the night. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how ridiculous it sounded. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag, locked the cabin, and started walking. The nearest road was several miles away, but I didn't care. I just needed to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. I didn't look back. I made it to a small village by late afternoon, found a cafe, and sat there for hours, just letting myself be surrounded by people, by voices, by the normal sounds of life. I never went back to the cabin. When the owner called, asking why I had left early, I made up an excuse, something about a family emergency. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't want to think about it. Even now, years later, I still see her sometimes. Not in real life, but in my mind when I close my eyes. Standing in the mist, watching. It was late autumn, and the small cabin in the woods stood like a silent sentinel against the overcast sky. I wasn't supposed to be there, not really, but my mind had been racing for weeks, and I needed somewhere far away, somewhere to think and breathe. A cabin in the middle of nowhere seemed perfect. The plan was simple. Spend a few days alone, no distractions, no people, just time to reset. The cabin, owned by a family friend, was isolated, just how I liked it. I drove for hours, winding through narrow, empty roads, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to stretch forever. The air was chilly, crisp, and carried the scent of damp leaves. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, I finally spotted the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, but cozy enough. It had a rustic charm, a bit worn down, but nothing that seemed alarming. Inside, it was the typical wooden interior. An old couch in the living room, a fireplace in the corner with some logs stacked beside it, a small kitchen with a single table and a couple of chairs. There were 2 rooms upstairs, one for me and one for the old friend who'd lent me the place. The place was more than enough for one person, and that was all I needed. As the first night fell, I lit the fire in the hearth and settled into the couch. The wind howled outside, and the trees rattled against the windows, but inside, it was warm. It should have been peaceful, but there was a feeling deep in my gut that wouldn't let go. It was a strange tension, something I couldn't explain. I brushed it off. That night, I woke up suddenly. The cabin was unnervingly quiet. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the room. I glanced around, my mind not fully awake. I could hear something, a tapping sound, slow but persistent. It wasn't the wind, nor the trees. It was coming from the direction of the door. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate tapping. My heart began to race. Someone or something was at the door. I stayed still, straining to hear more, to figure out what was going on. It was late, maybe even past midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. The thought of checking the door didn't sit well with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from the side table and slowly made my way toward the door. The tapping stopped the second I stood up, and everything went unnervingly quiet again. I slowly turned the handle and opened the door a crack. The porch outside was empty. No one was there, no sign of anyone or anything. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, convinced that I had imagined it. But as I stepped back inside, I noticed something on the ground near the door. A small, blood-stained piece of cloth. It was old, maybe a rag of some sort, but the blood was fresh. My heart skipped a beat, and panic began to creep in. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees again, but it felt different now. The isolation of the place, which had seemed so comforting before, now felt suffocating. I knew I couldn't just ignore this. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal out here. I was truly alone. The only option was to lock the door, bolt the windows, and wait until morning. But even then, I had this nagging feeling that the night was far from over. Hours passed. I must have fallen asleep eventually, but it wasn't a restful sleep. Every sound woke me up, and I stayed tense, my muscles sore from being on edge. When morning came, the sunlight seemed to bring a brief sense of relief, but it didn't last. I decided to investigate. I checked the porch again, hoping I had imagined everything, but the cloth was still there. I picked it up carefully, my hands trembling. It was an old, tattered piece of shirt, stained with dark red. I knew it wasn't mine, and it wasn't from any of the bedding in the cabin. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Someone had been here. I decided to search the area around the cabin, hoping to find some clue, some explanation that made sense. I grabbed the axe from beside the fireplace for protection, just in case, and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, but I pushed forward, the woods around me eerily silent. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of trees and underbrush. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I felt the need to keep going, like there was something I was supposed to uncover. As I walked deeper into the woods, a feeling of being watched crept over me. I stopped, scanning the area, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing, just trees, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt that unmistakable sense of dread. Then I heard it, the crunch of leaves underfoot. I spun around, my grip tightening on the axe. But there was no one there. The forest was still. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and started to turn back to the cabin. That's when I saw it. A trail in the dirt, leading off deeper into the woods. Someone had walked through here recently. The marks were fresh, and I wasn't alone anymore. I had no idea who it was or what they wanted, but I knew I had to follow the trail. I walked cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The path led me to a small clearing, and in the middle of it, I saw something that made my stomach churn. A fire pit. It looked like it had been used recently, the ashes still smoldering. And next to it, a series of discarded items, some old, some recent. A blood-stained jacket, a knife, a hatchet gleaming in the low light. I stepped back, my mind racing. There was someone out there, someone dangerous. I needed to get back to the cabin, lock the doors, and wait for help. But before I could turn around, I heard something behind me. The air grew thick with tension. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I stayed frozen in place, my eyes darting around, searching for the source of the sound. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, just a flash, but enough to make my blood run cold. I whirled around, swinging the axe, but there was nothing there, just the empty woods, the trees swaying in the wind. My breath came out in short gasps as I scanned the area, my mind reeling. I slowly made my way back to the cabin, not daring to take my eyes off the trees around me. Every crack, every rustle, made my heart skip a beat. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked every window and door, making sure everything was secure. I sat by the fire, every nerve on edge, waiting for daylight. But daylight came and went, and there was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur, and I never saw the person or whatever it was that had been watching me. But the fear never fully left. I left the cabin early, my heart still racing, and drove away, the weight of that lingering terror following me all the way home. It's been years since that weekend, and I still don't know who or what was out there in the woods. The cabin was abandoned shortly after, the family friend never returning. I don't blame them. I've never gone back, and I don't ever plan to. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some things are better left unknown. The woods are still out there, and whatever was lurking in them that night, I pray it's gone for good. It was late September, The kind of crisp autumn night when the air smells fresh but also carries a sense of cold that bites into your skin. I had just turned 27, and I was determined to spend a weekend out in the woods, away from the distractions of work and city life. My friend Ben, who was a few years older than me, invited me on a hunting trip to his family's cabin, located deep in the hills of northern Wyoming. The cabin wasn't much more than a small, one-room structure, but it had everything we needed. Ben's family used it for generations, and he knew these woods like the back of his hand. We left early on Friday morning, and by the time we arrived, it was late afternoon. The drive was long and winding, with nothing but trees and the occasional deer crossing the road. The landscape was beautiful but also isolated, and that isolation was exactly what I was looking for. No distractions, no noise, just a few days of peace. Ben and I spent the evening setting up, unpacking our gear, and making a fire outside. The night was still warm, with only the occasional breeze rustling through the trees. Ben talked about the hunts his grandfather used to go on, stories that made the woods feel even more mysterious. After dinner, we settled in for the night, with the sound of the crackling fire and the distant call of owls keeping us company. But something changed as the hours passed. It wasn't anything Ben said, or anything that happened directly. It was more like a growing discomfort that seemed to creep into the air itself. I noticed the shadows stretching unnaturally long, even though the fire was still burning brightly. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, the woods are full of strange sounds at night. The next morning, Ben and I set out to scout the area, looking for signs of game. The sun was shining, but there was a strange stillness in the air. No birds singing, no squirrels darting between the trees. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the forest eerily quiet. We walked for a few miles, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until we found the first sign that I realized just how bad it was. Ben pointed to the ground. "You see that?" he asked, his voice tight. I followed his gaze and saw a set of large, uneven footprints in the mud. They were deeper than a human's and irregular, as if something had been walking on two legs but with a strange gait, almost as if it were dragging one foot. "They don't look like anything I've seen before," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt.
Ben frowned.
"Yeah, I don't like it." We both stared at the tracks, our eyes scanning the ground for more. The strange thing was, the footprints didn't lead anywhere specific. They were erratic, almost like they were deliberately made to confuse. I tried to push the growing unease out of my mind and suggested we keep moving, but Ben was already looking around, his eyes darting through the trees. "It's probably nothing," I muttered. "Maybe just an animal with a limp." Ben didn't reply, but I could see he wasn't convinced. As we walked deeper into the woods, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or the rustle of leaves, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The forest was strangely empty. We spent the rest of the afternoon hunting, but the day felt off. We didn't see any game, and the air was thick with an unshakable sense of dread. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the forest. Ben seemed even more on edge than before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside the cabin, scraping sounds, like something was dragging itself along the ground. Every time I'd get up to check, the forest would be silent. No wind, no animals, just the sound of my own breathing. Around midnight, I heard it again. Something outside, walking slowly around the cabin. I wasn't sure what it was, but it was moving in a deliberate rhythmic pattern. My heart pounded as I crept to the window, trying to get a glimpse of whatever it was. But there was nothing. The forest was dark, and the moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy above. I sat back down, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or something harmless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My mind raced, remembering the strange tracks we'd found earlier. What kind of creature could leave footprints like that? Ben, who had been sleeping soundly beside me, woke up a few hours later. His eyes were wide, and his breathing was fast. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "I heard something," I whispered back, "but I don't know what it was." We both sat in silence for a moment, listening. There was nothing now, just the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but a cold knot had formed in my stomach. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I felt exhausted, but Ben seemed even more unsettled. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to be there. He didn't say much as we ate breakfast, but I could tell he was on edge. We decided to head back out into the woods, though neither of us felt good about it. The whole place felt wrong, but we couldn't explain why. As we walked deeper into the forest, we came across something that made my stomach drop. Another set of tracks, even larger than the ones we had found before. This time, they weren't just in the mud. They were scattered across the ground, like whatever had made them was circling us, walking in a wide arc. "This isn't normal," Ben muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We both stopped, staring at the tracks. They looked human, but they weren't. The shape of the foot was wrong, elongated, and the toes were too long. And there was something else. Scratches, deep gouges in the earth as if something had been dragging its claws through the dirt. I could feel my pulse racing. "Ben, what do you think this is?" Ben didn't answer. He just took a deep breath and began backing away, his eyes scanning the trees. I followed him, my own heart hammering in my chest. The silence of the woods was overwhelming. There was no breeze, no birds, nothing except the sound of our breathing. It wasn't until we reached the cabin that I realized how close we had gotten to the edge of our sanity. We had wandered too far into the woods, too far into a place we shouldn't have been. That night, the noises were louder. Scratching, tapping, something moving around the cabin. Ben was losing it. His eyes were wide, his face pale. He didn't want to go outside to check, but neither of us could stay inside. The air felt thick, oppressive. We stepped out into the night, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. As we moved toward the trees, I saw something standing at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. It was something in between, something that didn't belong in this world. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The thing was tall, nearly 7 feet, its limbs unnaturally long. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light of the moon. Its skin was pale, stretched tight across its bones, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, filled with sharp teeth. Ben whispered, "Run." We turned and bolted back toward the cabin, the thing's laughter ringing in our ears. It sounded like a human laugh, but it was distorted, almost mocking. My breath came in ragged gasps as we reached the door. Ben slammed it shut behind us, and we locked it, though I knew that wouldn't stop it if it wanted to get in. We didn't sleep. We couldn't. Every sound outside made our hearts skip a beat. The creature didn't leave. It was out there, circling, waiting. I don't know how long we stayed in the cabin, but by the time morning came, the creature was gone. The sun was rising, and the world outside looked peaceful again. But I knew better. We left the cabin that day, and neither of us spoke a word about what we had seen. There was no need. We both knew what it was. Skinwalker, a thing that shouldn't exist but did. It had been watching us the entire time, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. We never went back, and I never spoke to Ben again after that. The woods in Wyoming had claimed something that day, and I had no desire to find out what. had always found peace in nature. Growing up in a small town in Wyoming, I learned to enjoy the quiet moments spent alone in the wilderness. The soft rustle of the trees in the wind, the distant call of a bird, the quiet hum of insects, those were the sounds that calmed me. So, when I needed a break from the stress of everyday life, I would often retreat to my small cabin in the woods. It wasn't much, just a basic shelter with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a couple of rooms, but it was all I needed to disconnect. It was early October when I made the decision to take a weekend off. The leaves were just beginning to turn, their fiery reds and golds adding a burst of color to the dense green around the cabin. The weather forecast had promised a clear, crisp weekend, so I packed a few essentials, grabbed my dog, Bear, and headed out for the retreat. The drive was uneventful, the long, winding roads leading me deeper into the forest. As I passed the small town on the edge of the woods, I felt the familiar sense of peace settle over me. I knew it would be good to get away. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk, the low sun casting long shadows on the ground. Bear jumped out of the car and ran around, barking excitedly. I followed him inside, unpacking my bags and starting a fire in the fireplace. The warmth of the flames was comforting as the temperature outside dropped. That first night was like any other, peaceful and quiet. I made a simple dinner, enjoyed the solitude, and spent a few hours reading. Bear lay by the fire, content and calm. As the night deepened, I began to hear sounds from outside. Scratching at the door, light thumps against the windows, but I didn't think much of it. It was probably just an animal. We were deep in the woods, after all. But then, later in the night, I heard something that made me pause. It was a soft knock, the kind you'd hear if someone gently tapped on wood. I stood up, my heart thudding in my chest. I moved to the door, cautiously peering out the window. Nothing. I checked the back door, the windows, and even around the cabin. But there was no sign of anyone. Bear was growling now, low and menacing, his hackles raised. I tried to reassure him, though the unease gnawing at me only grew. The next morning, I chalked it up to a wild animal, maybe a raccoon or something larger. I went about my day, chopping wood and gathering some fresh water from the nearby stream. Bear stuck close to me, his eyes always scanning the surroundings. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, though. It wasn't just the strange knocks. The woods felt different, darker somehow. The breeze carried a subtle tension, the rustling of the leaves almost too loud. That evening, I decided to stay inside after sunset. I made a pot of soup and kept the fire burning brightly. Bear was unusually quiet, just sitting by the fire with his eyes fixed on the door. It was then that I heard it again, more distinct this time. A knock. I could feel my pulse quicken. Bear's growl was deep, vibrating the air. He stood up, his ears perked, and began pacing the cabin. This time, I didn't even think to check the window. The cabin was isolated, miles away from the nearest neighbor, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here. I didn't want to believe it, but I could feel it in my gut. Someone was out there. I grabbed my rifle from the closet. I wasn't much of a hunter, but I'd learned to handle myself in the woods. The sound of the wind rustling the trees outside was the only noise, save for the occasional rattle of the fire. I sat in silence, waiting, but the knocks didn't come again. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to the wind and the soft crackle of the fire. My nerves were on edge, every little sound making me jump. I checked the door once more, nothing. The cabin seemed empty, just as it had been before. But something wasn't right. Bear was still on high alert, staring at the door, his body tense. I stood up, carefully making my way to the back of the cabin. I was about to open the door when I heard a faint sound from behind me. A shuffle of footsteps, slow and deliberate. I spun around, rifle raised, heart hammering. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Nothing except the growing sense that I wasn't alone. The day passed slowly, with no further strange sounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I double-checked all the doors and windows before going to bed, securing the locks and sliding the heavy bar across the front door. Bear lay down beside the fire, his eyes never leaving the door. That night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't ignore. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't footsteps. It was a scrape, like something dragging along the ground outside. My heart raced as I crept to the window, trying to peer through the curtains. The moonlight cast long shadows across the clearing, but I couldn't see anything through the dark trees. My hand gripped the rifle tightly, my breath shallow. I heard the scrape again, closer now. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy through the dirt. I took a deep breath, moving to the door slowly. I pressed my ear against it, trying to listen for anything more, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Bear stood beside me, still, his eyes fixed on the door. The scraping stopped. Then came the knock again. But this time it was not soft. It was loud and forceful, as if someone was hammering at the door. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, ready to open it, rifle in hand. But before I could, the knock came again. But this time it wasn't at the door. It was at the window right next to my ear. I jumped back, adrenaline surging through me. I ran to the back door and threw it open, stepping out into the cold night air, rifle raised. But there was nothing except the eerie stillness of the woods and the feeling that I was being watched. Bear ran ahead, his fur bristling. I followed him through the clearing, scanning the trees. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, but the darkness seemed endless. Then I heard it, a faint rustle, just a soft crack of a twig breaking underfoot. I spun around, rifle raised, but again, there was nothing. The sound came again, but this time, it was from behind me. I turned, heart pounding, but I was too slow. A figure emerged from the shadows. I raised the rifle, but something in the way it moved, it wasn't right. It wasn't human. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, deep in my gut, that this wasn't something I could handle. The figure was tall, thin, and hunched, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. I could feel its gaze on me, a chill running down my spine. I raised the rifle to shoot, but before I could pull the trigger, it vanished back into the woods. I stood there, frozen, the weight of the rifle heavy in my hands. The wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time that night, the woods felt quiet, almost too quiet. I slowly made my way back to the cabin, my pulse still racing, the rifle clutched tightly in my hands. I checked the doors and windows one last time, securing the cabin as best I could. But as I sat by the fire, Bear by my side, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was out there in the woods, it wasn't human. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't stay another night. As I drove back to town, the peacefulness of the woods felt like a distant memory, replaced by a deep unease. I couldn't explain what happened, but I knew I'd never return to that cabin again. Some things in the woods are better left undisturbed. It had been one of those years where everything felt out of place. Stuck, unbalanced. Work, relationships, life in general, just felt like it wasn't coming together. So when the chance came to head out into the middle of nowhere and get away from everything for a while, I didn't hesitate. I needed peace. I needed silence. I needed to feel something different. The cabin I rented was deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that cell phone service didn't even make an attempt to work. The old wooden structure stood alone in a valley, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight. The air smelled thick with pine, and there was a crisp bite to it despite the early spring warmth. I drove up a narrow dirt road, my tires kicking up dust, the only sound my engine humming against the stillness of the wilderness. The place wasn't exactly luxurious, but that was the point. I didn't need anything fancy, just a roof over my head, a warm bed, and the promise of quiet. The cabin itself was older than I expected. The wood was faded and gray, with large cracks running through the exterior. The door creaked open on rusty hinges, and the floors groaned beneath my weight. It was the kind of place that felt as though it had been forgotten by time. There were no neighbors for miles, no passing traffic, just the trees and the silence, broken only by the occasional sound of wildlife. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly well kept. There was a small kitchen, a wood stove, a couple of chairs, and an old stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A small bedroom tucked in the back had a simple wooden bed and a nightstand, and the bathroom was just a tiny corner with a worn shower and an old sink. I spent the first day there setting up, unpacking my bags, getting used to the isolation. I wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt good to be away from everything. The first night, I lit a fire in the stove, made a simple meal, and settled down to read a book by the light of an oil lamp. The wind outside howled through the trees, but inside, the warmth of the fire made the cabin feel safe, like a fortress from whatever was outside. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice something odd. Every time I went near the windows to look out at the night, I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, hidden in the shadows, observing me from the woods. It was a creeping sensation that slid up my spine and settled at the base of my skull. It was irrational, I told myself. There was no one out there, just the wind and the rustling of leaves. Still, I couldn't shake it. The next few days passed quietly. I spent my time reading, cooking, and wandering the surrounding woods during the day. The silence was almost oppressive at times, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There were moments when I felt at peace, like the weight of the world had lifted off my shoulders. But that nagging feeling persisted, lurking in the back of my mind. It was on the fourth night that things began to get strange. I was sitting by the fire, the cabin now bathed in a dim orange glow, when I heard it, just a faint sound at first, a rustle in the trees, then a crunching of leaves. I froze, my eyes snapping to the window, but all I could see was the dark outline of trees and the faint shapes of rocks in the distance. The sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was moving outside, circling the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat still, not daring to move, unsure of what to do. The wind had died down, and everything outside was eerily still except for those noises. I tried to convince myself that it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but deep down I knew it wasn't. No animal made that kind of sound. It wasn't natural. I waited, holding my breath, listening intently. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet. But then, the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping underfoot came from just outside the cabin door. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. And then, nothing. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, my hands clenched around the armrests of the chair. The fire crackled softly in the corner, its flames casting long, flickering shadows across the room. I kept waiting for something, anything to happen, but it never did. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the old lantern off the table, holding it in front of me as I slowly made my way to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, and for a second, I thought I might turn back, but something inside me, some primal instinct, pushed me forward. I swung the door open. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I stepped outside, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound breaking the silence. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the surrounding trees. There was nothing, no sign of movement, no indication that anything had been there. I stood there for a long time, scanning the area, but the woods seemed empty. In the distance, the dark outline of the trees stretched out before me, like a vast, impenetrable wall. I don't know what I expected, but I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it had all been in my head. But as I turned to go back inside, my eyes caught something on the ground. A footprint. A single, clear impression in the dirt, just outside the door. It was large, too large for any animal I could think of, and the edges were sharp, almost like the print of a boot. My heart skipped a beat. Whoever, whatever, had been out there wasn't an animal. It was a person. Panic gripped me then. I backed inside quickly, slamming the door shut and locking it. I pushed the couch in front of it just to be sure. My mind raced with possibilities. Who could be out there? What did they want? And why were they watching me? I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that I was being paranoid. But the truth was, I was terrified. I hadn't come out here to deal with something like this. This wasn't the peace I had been looking for. This was the opposite. This was the kind of fear that gnawed at your bones, the kind of fear that made you doubt your own sanity. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless tossing and turning. Couldn't sleep. Every noise outside made me jump. Every shadow cast by the firelight seemed to stretch and twitch in unnatural ways. I was on edge, my senses heightened to the point of exhaustion. When morning finally came, I was relieved, but also afraid. The sun rose slowly over the hills, casting a golden light over the trees, but I felt no comfort from it. The events of the night before were still fresh in my mind. I spent the day inside, pacing, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about leaving, but something held me there. Fear, maybe, or pride. I wasn't sure. But as I stood by the window, staring out at the trees, something caught my eye. Movement. There, just at the edge of the woods, a figure standing in the shadows, watching. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and as the sun cast long shadows across the ground, I could see it move. A slow, deliberate step forward, then another. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette. And then it was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, my eyes locked on the spot where the figure had been. I couldn't see anything anymore. The woods were empty, just as they had been before. But this time, I didn't feel relieved. I felt sick. I wasn't alone. I packed up and left the cabin that day, driving as fast as I could down the narrow dirt road, away from that place, away from whatever had been out there. I never went back to the cabin. The fear didn't fade for a long time. Even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't know who or what it was, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't the isolation I was searching for. It was something darker, something I couldn't escape. I was 34 years old when it happened. It was the kind of thing you don't talk about much because people wouldn't believe you anyway. Or maybe they would, but that wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't make it any less real or any less terrifying. It happened in the fall of 2018. The air had that sharp crispness to it, the kind that tells you winter isn't far away. I had taken a job watching over a remote logging site in northern Montana. The company was cutting deeper into the forest than usual, and they wanted someone to stay up at the site overnight, mostly to keep an eye on the equipment and make sure nobody was messing around where they shouldn't be. There had been a few incidents the year before, some vandalism, stolen fuel, even a few cases where people had gotten hurt because they wandered into dangerous areas. They didn't want trouble and they didn't want a lawsuit, so they paid me to sit out there in a small one-room cabin and make sure things stayed quiet. I'd done a few jobs like it before. It was easy work, mostly boring, but it paid well enough. The company had given me an ATV to get around, a radio to check in once in a while, and a cheap cot to sleep on inside the cabin. I brought my own food, a thermos of coffee, and a rifle. Not because I expected trouble, but because I didn't like the idea of being deep in the woods without one. The cabin itself was old, probably built back in the 60s. It wasn't much, just a wooden box with a tin roof, a single window, and a door that didn't close all the way unless you jammed it hard. Inside, there was a small table, a rusted-out wood stove, and a few shelves nailed to the walls. The cot was shoved into one corner, and there was a lantern in case I needed light after dark. I'd been out there for a little over a week before things started getting strange. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd spend the evening making rounds, checking on the machinery, making sure everything was locked up. Then I'd go back to the cabin, eat something cold out of a can, and try to sleep. It wasn't comfortable, but I'd done worse. Then, on the 8th night, I found the first footprint. It was just outside the cabin, in the patch of dirt by the door. A single boot print, half smudged but fresh. I hadn't seen it the night before. I checked my own boots against it just to be sure, but it was bigger than mine. That was odd, but not impossible. Maybe one of the loggers had come up during the day and I'd missed them. Or maybe someone had wandered up from the road. I didn't like it, but it wasn't something to panic about. I kept an eye out after that. The next night, I made sure to walk around a little more, check for anything unusual. The second footprint showed up 2 nights later. This time, it was farther from the cabin, out near the tree line. It was another single print, deep in the mud. No other tracks leading to it, no sign of where the person had come from or where they had gone. Just one footprint, alone in the dirt. That unsettled me. I started locking the door at night, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. I kept the rifle close, too. 2 more days passed. Nothing happened. No more footprints, no noises, nothing. I started thinking maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I'd been wrong about the first print and it had been mine after all. Then, on the 12th night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the window. It was soft at first. A light, rhythmic tapping. 3 beats. Pause. 3 more beats. I lay there, still as death, listening.
Top, top, top,
Pause.
top, top, top.
It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too steady. I turned my head just enough to glance at the window. There was nothing there, just blackness. The reflection of the lantern flickering dimly on the glass. Then it stopped. I sat there for a long time listening. The woods were silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a branch tapping against the glass. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. There were no trees close enough for a branch to reach the window. The next night, it happened again.
Top, top, top,
Pause.
top, top, top.
I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just waited. Then, just as suddenly as before, it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following day, I found another footprint. This one was right beneath the window. I was done. I radioed the logging company and told them I was leaving. They could send someone else if they wanted, but I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my things, loaded the ATV, and left before the sun went down. A few weeks later, I heard the company had shut down the logging site. They wouldn't say why, but I think I already knew. That's the kind of thing that sticks with you. The kind of thing you don't talk about because there's nothing to explain. No answers, no reason. Just footprints in the dark.